Round of applause. Just yes.
Good evening. My name is Iwona Skowronek. I'm VP of Operations at SenseFix. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this fireside chat, Blitzscaling from the East, featuring Chris Ye, and being brought to you by Alpha Wolf Summit, Venture Cafe, Warsaw, and SenseFix. It's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Balaji Renukumar, the founder and CEO of SenseFix. SenseFix is a digital workflow startup that uses multimodal AI and mixed reality to automate workflows and decision-making in logistics and operation and maintenance in commercial buildings and industrial facilities. The company is headquartered in Silicon Valley with an operating office in Poland and subsidiaries in the UK and Bahrain. Balaji was a former scientist associated with German Aerospace Center. He holds a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering from Indian Institute of Technology. He is a second-time founder and is densely connected with startup ecosystem in the UK, Europe, US, Middle East, and ASEAN regions. He was mentored by Chris during early days of SenseFix in a cohort in Palo Alto, California. And SenseFix is growing through seed stages, engaging customers from US and Europe, and raising over $3 million in investment. And currently setting up a 25 person team in Poland. So Balaji, being an earnest Blitzscaling student himself, is keen to interview Chris to explore Blitzscaling. So without further ado, over to you, Balaji.
Thank you, Iwona. So welcome to all Blitzscaling enthusiasts in person in Warsaw, and those joining via YouTube and other platforms. Welcome to this fireside chat without the fire, although. Let me just take a moment in resonating the sentiments of people in the room, as well as millions of Polish and Europeans in actually going to condemn the war next door that's happening in Ukraine, and also hope peace prevails sooner. Okay, I'm now super excited about the session today on Blitzscaling. Everyone wants to know how to take companies from 0 to billion in a couple of years. Who else can take us through this other than the very author who wrote the book on Blitzscaling, Chris Ye? Chris will shed light on many aspects of Blitzscaling and thoughts around it before we take up questions for the last 20 minutes of this session. We are doing it as a hybrid session. The viewers on YouTube can post their questions on the chat wherever you are, whereas the attendees in Warsaw, you will get opportunity to ask your questions in the end. So welcome, Chris. Warsaw and the CEE startup ecosystem is calling you. You co-authored this book on Blitzscaling with Reid Hoffman, the billionaire founder of LinkedIn. You co-authored another book, Alliance, a New York Times best-selling book with Reid and Kasnocha in the past. I don't know if I pronounce the name properly. I'm sorry. So you have been an investor or mentor advisor to over 100 startups since 1995, a writer, an accomplished speaker, and you hold 2 degrees from Stanford and also hold an MBA from Harvard Business School, where you were a Baker Fellow. You serve as a co-founder of Global Scaling Academy, which teaches individuals and organizations how to plan for and execute hypergrowth. You are also a co-founder of Blitzscaling Ventures, which invests in world's fastest growing ventures. So, Chris, To set the stage for this session, our viewers would like to get a glimpse into how did it all begin for you.
Oh, perfect. And again, thank you, Balaji, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for hosting me and for joining me on this evening or afternoon or morning or night, wherever you happen to be in the world. So it all began in a relatively straightforward way. I grew up in Southern California and then went to Stanford for my undergrad. And while I was at Stanford, this was in the early 1990s, this was when the internet was really just taking off. And so I was part of the first class at Stanford where, when we were freshmen, we got email addresses assigned to us. And during the time I was there, we computerized things like the registration system. And by the time I finished at Stanford, that was when the internet was first starting, what the World Wide Web was first starting to get going. I, in fact, remember using things like Gopher and WAIS in addition to Netscape, which was a brand new phenomenon that hadn't yet come out yet. It was originally NCSA Mosaic. That was what Mark Andreessen had created. So I was there at the very dawn of the commercial internet. And from there, instead of going into a conventional kind of job, I decided I would follow the startup world. And I joined D.E. Shaw and Company, which is a company that is very secretive, but is best known as being the company Jeff Bezos worked for before he founded Amazon. I always tell everyone, sadly, he left about 18 months before I got there. So I don't know Jeff personally. I'm not being invited onto a rocket ride anytime soon. Not that I would go. But ever since then, I've been focused on the internet and the startup world because it's just the most exciting part of the economy, one of the most exciting parts of being here on this planet. And I've gone from being a early employee or founding employee to being a founder to ultimately being a writer, an author, and an investor and board member.
Great. Would you mind telling us what were the key learnings and experiences that led you to end up writing this book?
So it really came down to the fact that when we began this book, we started working on the ideas in 2015. And this was during the beginning of what we now call the unicorn era, when startups were being highly valued and growing very quickly. And what we were trying to do is to explain, well, why now? Why are all these companies growing so quickly? Why are they so highly valued? Why are so many of these companies based in Silicon Valley? Because none of these things is necessarily obvious. It's not necessarily obvious what changes occurred to make all of these things happen. And blitzscaling is an attempt to explain it. And our basic conclusion is that the internet changed everything, that it brought us all together and connected us, which meant there were more and more winner take most markets with network effects, which meant there were more and more global markets that were enormously valuable. And as a result, there are more and more companies that are becoming global winners at scale, which makes them hugely valuable and makes both the founders and the employees and the investors lots of money.
So, to all our viewers, I really recommend all of you to get a copy of this book and read it. If you are a startup founder or a head of a new product service division in a corporation trying to do an entrepreneurship thing, you must read this book. We all know how a group of Silicon Valley bright minds come together and build massive companies. Imagine the same guys coming together to analyze how unicorns are built, what strategies they follow, how they pivot, and on and on. And they write a book on it. And when those guys are founders and investors themselves, that's what this book is. This is written by Chris and Reid Hoffman, who is the founder and see who used to be the founder, who is the founder of LinkedIn, who used to be the CEO of LinkedIn before it got sold to Microsoft. I think it's extremely valuable for all of us. So, Chris, why do you think blitzscaling, as we know, did originate in the far west, the Silicon Valley to be specific? Was it a cultural thing?
Yeah, so it was. If you look at the history of Silicon Valley, it is a very interesting combination of the technology side through Stanford University, UC Berkeley, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, and the like. There were always a lot of scientists, especially on the computer science side, based around here. And that, of course, dates all the way back to Hewlett Packard in the 1930s, being the first big tech company to rise in Silicon Valley. But there was also the counterculture. The Bay Area here was a center for the American counterculture movement in the 1960s. There were hippies, there were people who were utopians and thinking about a better world. And so people were just more open to trying things. They weren't bound to the same traditions that other parts of the United States, like the East Coast, were, perhaps even other parts of the world. So you had this confluence of incredibly smart technologists, a culture where people were encouraged to think different, as Steve Jobs would say. And in addition, this also happened to be the place where a number of pioneering venture capitalists set up shop. So some of the very first venture capitalists of all came out to the Bay Area. People like Georges Doriot, who began at Harvard Business School, but began making investments out here as well. Don Valentine, the founder of Sequoia. And when all of these things came together, it created a set of network effects that really made Silicon Valley the preeminent startup cluster. And that's interesting because it really should be Boston. Boston had so much more money, so much more history coming out of World War II. And yet Silicon Valley ended up succeeding because it was a more open society, because people were less bound by tradition, because people were more willing to collaborate. And there's a lot of lessons there for all the other technology clusters around the world who want to also become a place where many unicorns can be born.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you mentioned it was ought to be Boston and on the eastern United States, especially. I think there is this saying, Stanford University was actually set up to be the Harvard of the West. So how did this slip from the hands of the eastern United States and then land into Stanford and the surrounding Bay Area? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mentioned the cultural side, but there's also a highly underappreciated sort of structural reason. So, one of the things that happened in the Bay Area is that California does not enforce non compete agreements in employment contracts. It basically means that if you leave your company to start another company, or if you leave your company to go to a rival, you can't steal ideas or take IP, but they can't stop you from going there. And so there was much greater talent mobility in Silicon Valley than there was in Boston. The other thing was the nature of the companies in Boston tended to be much more vertically integrated. They tended to be much more siloed. They didn't really cooperate with a lot of other folks. And this actually shows up in the patent data. So if you look at the patent data, you can look at who the inventors are and which companies they worked for, and you can basically create an innovation graph. And in the case of Boston, the innovation graph looks like a tree with very distinct branches. Each company is separate. The people only work with the other people on that branch. Whereas with Silicon Valley, it looks like a very dense mesh with people working with other people at other companies in different times. A person might have 5 different patents, each with a different company. And that remixing of ideas, that greater collaboration, thanks to that lack of non-compete agreements, is one of the hidden reasons why Silicon Valley overtook Boston.
Oh yeah, I can imagine what you say, because in our own startup SenseFix, we have a couple of advisors from Google who hold daytime job at Google, and they kind of advise as well as work sometimes. So I think I know when you said about the non-compete and other clauses of the Silicon Valley based companies, permitting the overall population out there to kind of participate in startup building. I'm not sure. I don't want to comment on those rules and then laws when it comes to Europe and then other parts of the globe. I think that could be one key factor which really helped the Valley begin all this. And also, there are blitzscalers in the East,
Absolutely.
out of the United States, today. But they are largely copycats of the Amazons, Ubers, and WhatsApps of the Silicon Valley. We have some early adopter markets and startup conducive ecosystems, for example, in the Netherlands, Australia. Even after huge blitzscaling successes from the Silicon Valley, why hasn't that trickled eastwards to these destinations in founding original companies?
Well, it has to some extent. So there are a certain set of extremely powerful companies that really arose in markets outside the United States. So, for example, if we look at one of the companies that is just dominating right now, which is ByteDance, which operates TikTok, that's a company where there was Silicon Valley DNA because partially it came from an acquisition of a startup called Musical.ly. But it's also the case that TikTok came out of the algorithms that ByteDance developed for their news service. And then they eventually turned around and applied those relevancy algorithms to social media and really changed the landscape. Here in the United States, TikTok now has more watch time than YouTube, which is pretty remarkable, right? YouTube is an astonishing success that's still growing rapidly, but TikTok just zoomed up behind it and overtook it. Same for TikTok and Facebook. And that's a model that came out of not the Silicon Valley, although there's a Silicon Valley influence, but from China. And then the other thing, if we take a look at the rise of super apps are things that have really taken off outside the United States, really haven't taken off in the United States. Obviously, we're all familiar with Tencent and WeChat in China, but also in Latin America, super apps like Rappi are very powerful as well. So I think it's absolutely possible to create these great ideas and great companies outside of Silicon Valley. And sometimes it's even an advantage. In the case of Spotify, which comes out of the Nordics, because they were in a smaller market, they were able to more easily gain the cooperation of the record labels to do legal music streaming. Whereas in the United States, it would have been much harder at first because they would say, well, you can't prove it. You have to pay us $100 million up front. It just makes it much harder. So I do think that this is starting to happen. But it still is the case that it's just so much easier to start a company in Silicon Valley. That it just means that more ideas develop here. And if you want to start a company, and you know this, having spent time in Silicon Valley, if you have a great idea, you can probably find people who will give you some money. Maybe not as much as you'd like, but you'll probably get some money. And meanwhile, all of the service providers, the lawyers, and other folks that you need to work with will agree to defer their fees because they're all dreaming of putting their effort into the next Google and getting a piece of the action and becoming wealthy that way. So as a result, the system is just less, there's just so much less friction for someone who wants to build a company, and that attracts people to come over here and build great companies. But that doesn't mean it can't be done elsewhere in the world. It just means that it may be a little harder.
So do you think in the East, outside the United States or outside the Silicon Valley, this blitzscaling is happening slowly, or is it attributed to some kind of human herd mentality that the investors in, say, Europe or Asia or other regions have simply got used to not betting on anything that is not tried and tested in the Silicon Valley?
Yes, so there absolutely is an issue around the investor base, right? The investors being more conservative, less willing to fund. I mean, my partner at Blitzscaling Ventures, Scott Johnson, often describes one of the reasons why he wanted to start Blitzscaling Ventures with me and Jeff Abbott is he said, I got tired of funding companies here on the East Coast and then seeing the Silicon Valley companies get twice as much funding and then eat our lunch. I want to be on the side doing the eating as opposed to the side being eaten. So it absolutely is the case that the investors are an issue, but that also begins to speak to why this is becoming less of an issue for entrepreneurs. So increasingly, and here at Blitzscaling Ventures, we survey the deal-making activity of all the top 35 VCs, especially the ones in Silicon Valley. And more of them are looking overseas for their investments. They're investing in Europe, they're investing in Asia, they're investing in Latin America, even starting to invest in Africa, because they believe that there are greater returns available out there. And because the competition is lighter, right? You have a bunch of more conservative traditional investors, like, great, I can go over here and I can buy into a company and its growth for a lot less money than I would in Silicon Valley. And that's the other thing. It's just so incredibly expensive to live in Silicon Valley. Company, individual employee, let's say that you're a young person starting out, you need a place to live, you're spending $3,000 to $4,000 a month on rent. It makes it very expensive. And so companies have higher burn rates. It's harder for them to hire. They have to pay people more. Whereas in many other parts of the world, in the East, the cost of living is just so much lower, and yet there's still plenty of brilliant people who can do amazing things.
So continuing on the investors, do you honestly think VCs play an equal, if not more decisive role to blitzscaling an idea?
So the question can be interpreted in two different ways. The way number one is when it comes to blitzscaling, who's most important? The answer there is very simple. It's the entrepreneur. Venture capitalists are always the secondary players, and venture capitalists would do well to remember that. Not all of them do, but the good ones do remember that. They remember that they are here to serve the entrepreneur and to facilitate the entrepreneur's success. They're not doing it themselves. However, it is also true that specifically for blitzscaling opportunities, venture capitalists are more important because the incredible growth generally requires incredible amounts of capital. And so it's really essential to be able to get great investors on board as you blitzscale. And that means that getting great investors is more important for a blitzscaler than it is for just a slower growth company.
Yeah, because most of us think there might be, different dynamics in the blitzscaling landscape. The way the VCs make up their minds to unload hundreds of millions of dollars for a blitzscaling phase of a startup. So are the dynamics slightly different here? Meaning, do investors still bet on, okay, the same rules, 2 or 3 Stanford, Harvard grads in their early 20s, having a minimum viable product and a product market fit? Okay, let's go invest. Or do you see investors look at the blitzscaling phase of a startup in a different way?
Well, they still love that stereotypical founding team, of course. And there was a bunch of research that First Round Capital did that showed that you, in fact, did get better returns from investing in founders from Stanford and MIT. As it turns out that the absolute best thing to do to get good returns was to invest in a female founder from MIT. That was actually what worked out best in their database. But of course, that's just a statistic. And each individual entrepreneur is a statistic of one. The statistics don't necessarily apply. So if you did not go to Harvard or Stanford for your college or graduate degree, no worries. It's still possible to build great companies. And that's because more and more investors are responding to the traction that they see out there. Right? They see companies that have been able to grow rapidly, that are doing things they never expected. Take the whole world of Web3. Originally, Web3 was the province primarily of Bitcoin maximalists and other people who were on the fringes. And it didn't attract people. There were random child actors or crazy guys who became billionaires as a result of this. But then once it became mainstream, now all of a sudden, they're pouring money into the companies that already have traction. But B, all of a sudden, those Stanford and MIT folks start building Web3 startups as well. So, we generally see that sort of Wild West story in the United States where it's an open frontier and it doesn't matter where you came from. And then as all the money moves in and things become more settled, then the traditional structures of society keep coming back. But the good news is there's always more frontiers. In the United States, they ran out of room. Eventually, they hit the Pacific Ocean. But when it comes to startups, human ingenuity is unlimited.
Okay. So at this point, I would also like to jump into how much the universities play a role, not just on blitzscaling, but all the things surrounding startup building. Of course, you in the Silicon Valley have been fortunate to have Stanford and Berkeley. So thinking about our region here, for example, the Central and Eastern Europe. So traditionally, there are not so world famous kick-ass universities. Let me say that. I'm sorry for my French. But how do universities, or how did universities play a role in shaping this blitzscaling trend and the ecosystem in the Silicon Valley, the Stanford and Berkeley to name? And how do you think those the universities elsewhere in other regions of the world should play a role in making this conducive?
So let me talk about the Silicon Valley University model because it has been an incredibly powerful force for producing great companies. By the way, it's not just limited to Stanford. One of the most incredible things I've ever found is the University of Utah's computer science department in one class produced the founders of Pixar, of Adobe, of Xerox PARC in a single class. So there are other great schools and other great teams everywhere. But what has made the universities in Silicon Valley so effective is a combination of research funded by the government and private corporations into basic technologies and applications. And that's what allowed them to build out the new chips, the new operating systems, the new ways of doing things that underlie most of these business models. But then in addition, there is a culture that just accepts and even encourages students and faculty to get involved in entrepreneurship. If you go to Stanford and you talk to a Stanford professor, and especially in the engineering and computer science department, the chances that they have a venture capital fund, a startup, or have at least made angel investments is about 100% because they're right in the middle of everything. And the school encourages them to do that. It doesn't say, oh, no, you can't do that. The school says, that's fantastic. That adds to the brand of the school. So that is a huge help. Now, the other reason why colleges and universities are so important is that ultimately, and this is underappreciated, colleges and universities generally cause the cities and towns that they're located in to become better places to live. So the creative professionals, they're generally highly educated. They want to go places where there are great restaurants and good culture and museums and other smart people to talk with. And that basically describes a college town. And so the college makes the town more appealing to the people who will hopefully then stick around and work at these companies, whether or not they're alumni of the universities themselves.
It's actually great to hear what you mentioned in the earlier part of this answer, that maybe in the US as well, everything would have started through research fundings and the government support, and because especially in this part of the world, the EU and other public money is flowing into the startup ecosystem heavily. So we might be up for a big blitzscaling trend in the next decade or so, when the same happened in the Silicon Valley few years ago. So now jumping into the blitzscaling accounts, what was the earliest account of a company that grew by blitzscaling that comes to your mind? So can you take us through that journey?
Absolutely. So I think that one of the most important examples of blitzscaling, which actually came from a company that was established, but was blitzscaling it to a new market, was IBM. So IBM, most people who are young might not be as aware today, but once upon a time, IBM was the most powerful technology company in the world. It was synonymous with technology for decades, and it was the most valuable company in technology for decades as well. And the reason IBM became so valuable is because it made a blitzscaling bet on the System 360 mainframe computer. Now, at the System 360 mainframe computer, cost in its research and development, I think something like 2 to 3 times the annual revenues of IBM at that point. It was a make or break thing for the company. They invested a truly colossal amount of money into developing this system, which was, as they say, more of a modular system, more of a services-based system, right? Instead of having a monolithic computer, you had all these different modules that you could put together. It resembled and presaged much of the way that we have, Amazon Web Services today. It's not as easy as just spinning up another virtual instance, but you could add on additional blocks of System 360 and build out your system ever larger and larger. And of course, this is a blitzscaling opportunity because we have an operating system involved, we have a platform involved, there's strong network effects. And the result was IBM went from a company that was known for creating tabulating machines for census results into being the world's first computing giant. And that lead that it gained as a result of that kept it as the world's preeminent technology company for multiple decades.
So did it happen inside IBM all by accident, or did
It did
they
not.
have or
So
did they have to go through a lot of painful make mistake and learn iterations?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The earlier versions, their earlier attempts to get into computing did not work. And so they had to learn from those. There was painful trial and error. And the other thing was the company had what was essentially a founder. So the leader of IBM at the time was Thomas Watson Jr. His father had started the company, really took it over. Thomas Watson Sr. was a salesman. He was selling the CTR machines for tabulating census results. He's like, wow, they seem to sell well. I think this company is worth it. Let me try to actually buy it. And he took over the company, renamed it IBM International Business Machines, and built up, IBM typewriters. Like the IBM before Thomas Watson Jr. was a typewriter company. People even today, like if they're really old, they'll remember the IBM Selectric typewriter, which was an electric typewriter, which meant instead of, I sound so old when I say this, but there were manual typewriters where you pushed a key and it was directly mechanically connected to a letter, which was made out of metal, which would go against a typewriter ribbon, which had carbon permeated into it, and you would pound that against a paper that you rolled through. And that was how we printed things. I know it sounds insane, but that was actually how it was done. And IBM had electrical typewriters where you could type the keys and you didn't have to pound them with your fingers. And this was a huge, huge advance and made the company successful. But what Thomas Watson Jr. had as the refounder of the company, he took over for his dad. He had the ownership, he had the moral authority, he had the willingness to take this giant risk of investing all this money in System 360 and betting the company. Right? That's something that only a founder can do. It's very difficult for a hired hand CEO to bet the company. Thomas Watson Jr. bet the company, bet his father's legacy, and won.
I would like to, for the benefit of some of our viewers who still are not very, proficient with the idea of blitzscaling, which you beautifully describe in the book as prioritizing speed over efficiency. Would you, in your own words, explain the concept in a kind of a textbook fashion for a couple of minutes so that all of us are on the loop?
Absolutely. So, as I sort of referenced in passing, the reason why there are more blitzscaling opportunities today is because there are more and more globally connected markets where network effects can occur. Now, why are the network effects important? The network effects are important because what they mean is that as the scale of the company grows, the value of the product to each individual user or customer grows. And that does two things. The first is as the company is growing rapidly and the value per customer grows, then you are getting exponential value creation. So that's why the companies become valuable so quickly. But in addition, as that value per customer grows, it means that it becomes increasingly difficult for any competitor to take those customers away from you because they can copy your product exactly. Their product will be this valuable, and your product will be this valuable because of the network effects. And so that dynamic, the long-term sustainable competitive advantage of the network effect, is what drives the winner take most market dynamic. And if that's the case, if the market can be won and once won, held onto for decades, printing money along the way, then your overwhelming objective should be win the market. That means getting to scale, or critical scale rather, faster than anyone else. And if that means prioritizing speed over efficiency, so be it. Now, again, inefficiency is not a virtue. There's no value to wasting money. But what it means instead is investing that money to achieve greater speed in order to win the market.
To any first comer or to most of common people, it sounds really crazy that investors and the entire ecosystem would bet on speed over efficiency, because efficiency has been classical way of growing a business. So do you think, as you mentioned, once these customers become or get the value and they stay loyal to the first company, but you know how I think Swift was originated as a competitor to Uber. So in spite of big investor money, do you still believe that it's not possible once the first mover takes all those customers? Even big money can't take them away to be loyal to another company.
Yes, so it depends on the nature of the market as well. So the interesting thing with Uber and ride hailing in general is that the network effect is strong, but it does not remain strong at greater levels of scale. You get to a certain level of scale, enough to be able to have the liquidity, get the customers to your door, to get the driver to your door within a short enough period of time, let's say 5 to 10 minutes. And beyond that, it doesn't help that much, right? Will somebody say, well, I'm really going to switch apps, or I'm going to pay more money to get someone there in 3 minutes rather than 5 minutes? Probably not. And so as a result of that, it's been possible for people to create Uber, or rather other ride hailing companies around the world. Uber has either had to acquire them, as it did with Kareem in the Middle East, or it has been forced into basically ceding the territory to their competitor, as in the case of Didi. Like Uber went to compete head to head with Didi in China, and in the end, Uber couldn't compete. The Chinese government basically said, we're going to end this competition. And Uber did well to actually trade their Uber China for a stake in Didi. But that's an example of how it does not create a single global winner. In contrast, a company like Airbnb, the network effect continues to get stronger because the selection matters so much. Again, it's hard to get to the point where there's so much density that it no longer matters, right? The density always matters when it comes to Airbnb because the pricing is so variable and the nature of the properties are so variable. And they're not coming to your door. It doesn't matter where they're coming from. The location actually matters. And so as a result, it's much stronger for Airbnb than it is for Uber.
Yeah. You have done such a beautiful job in observing and analyzing how these companies grew into the mammoths they have become, the way they grew, and which is like almost like a class, textbook for founders wanting to build massive companies. If you succeed in your mission of educating everyone on blitzscaling, and every founder starts blitzscaling, then how does one blitzscaler beat the other working on the same or similar idea? Any secret sauces you want to share, not in the book?
So I'll say a couple of things. First of all, that would be wonderful. One of the things that we wrote the book to do was to make sure these ideas spread far beyond Silicon Valley because there's so many smart people in the world. And it's not some sort of silly zero sum competition where it's like, oh, a great company got started outside of Silicon Valley. That's bad for Silicon Valley. No, when there are great companies started anywhere, that's good for humanity as a whole. So that is a wonderful thing. And that's absolutely something that we would like to see. Now, when it comes to blitzscaling, it is very important to note that only a small proportion of opportunities are blitz scalable. We look at hundreds, 100 to 200 deals every month. And out of those 100 to 200 deals every month, less than 10 deals are the ones that we consider truly blitz scalable. So it's a tiny fraction of opportunities, even of the companies that the world's greatest VCs have already said, yes, we want to back them. We think that these companies are really valuable. So blitzscaling remains rare, but you can apply the ideas of blitzscaling to move faster, whatever your circumstances, wherever you happen to be. And then finally, the most important thing for blitzscalers and the people who are running these companies is to understand that they have a strong need to unlearn. So we all understand the importance of learning. Everyone's like, yeah, we got to learn. It's a lifelong learning, continuous learning, all these things. But we also have to unlearn. Blitzscaling companies grow so quickly that the lessons of the past very rapidly decay and get to the point where they're counterproductive. And the companies and founders who are better able to unlearn lessons that made them successful and abandon those things in favor of what will make them successful in the future, those blitzscalers are much more likely to succeed.
I clearly agree to what you just said, especially I have made a first-hand experience of some of the founders and startup ecosystem people in the East failing to quickly unlearn because there are traditional techniques that have been there which they have learned, but what actually matters right now to grow fast is a whole bunch of other rules. And also, I think that's a very good segue for this point. Way back in 2018-19, you remember, Chris, when we first met, I said, as an outsider to the Silicon Valley, I found entrepreneurship was the religion in the Valley. And this act of pitching was the ritual. Now, entrepreneurship has spread like a wildfire from Seattle to Wellington, New Zealand to Buenos Aires to Tokyo. My fellow founders around the globe have rehearsed and mastered this ritual of pitching and the social media footprint. How much important are these elements of pitching and social media outings for the founders in the lead up to their blitzscaling stage of startup building?
So they fall into the category of what I call necessary but insufficient. So I often teach a workshop on storytelling. And I am a huge believer in the power of being able to tell a story. And pitching is basically storytelling and telling a story that's going to compel, that's going to elicit emotions, that's going to persuade and get people to open up their checkbooks and give you lots of money. And those are all very necessary. You need to have them. But I think sometimes people get so caught up in the pitching that they forget that they actually need to build their business. They're like, oh yeah, I know I need to work on the prototype, but let me instead focus on my Y Combinator application or going to this pitch contest or something like that. And I tell those founders, listen, it's very important to be a great pitch person. It's very important to be able to convey your story. But you know what's even more important? Having the basis for the story, having the business that is growing rapidly. I am a brilliant storyteller, but beyond a certain point, let's say you're trying to raise a Series B or Series C, if the results aren't there, you're not going to be able to raise the money. You might be able to weave a great story and raise a pre-seed round, but you can't do that later on. And you aren't going to be able to get all the way to an exit or IPO without building something of substance.
In your book, you lay utmost emphasis on these network effects. I think through network effects, the general population also participates in blitzscaling. I think it's true to say we are living in a blitzscaling world today. So can you enlighten us in your own words on the most important network effects that would affect some of the ecosystems here in the East, especially in Europe?
Absolutely. So there are certain types of business models that just lend themselves very strongly to network effects. We didn't frame them explicitly as such, but you've heard me talk about them. So the first is any sort of communications platform. Now, this can take many forms. It can be a pure messaging service like a WhatsApp. It can be a social network like a Facebook or a Snap. It can be a communications tool, even an enterprise tool like a Slack. And these communications platforms, because the value comes from having other people that are on the platform, they have really strong network effects. Another really critical network effect is the network effect of the marketplace, primarily the two-sided marketplace, where you have buyers and sellers. And there, the buyers obviously want to go where the sellers are. The sellers want to go where the buyers are. And the most powerful marketplaces, like an Airbnb, are ones where buyers are sellers and sellers are buyers as well. Because then all of a sudden you have this incredible ability for people to cross over, and that generates virality. It's not a network effect, it's virality, but that's also really essential. eBay also displayed this, right? If you've ever sold something on eBay, you've almost certainly bought something on eBay as well. And so that buyer seller relationship is really critical. Finally, we referred to a couple of these, but the platform network effect is the reason why every company is always eager to advertise itself as a platform, because the platform network effect means that as you develop things for your platform, the other developers develop for your platform as well. It is the center of gravity, it's the place where people come to work together. And having a platform, if you really build a great ecosystem, means you could just collect money in perpetuity. I mean, look at what Apple has done. The Apple App Store is this incredible platform where they take 30% of every dollar that flows through it. I mean, it's probably the greatest business model of all time. And that's the reason why Apple is the most valuable company in the world.
Right. Yeah. So I think I already see some of questions pouring in. This would be my last question of the main session. Again, continuing on the network effect. I think in on the stage over there in Warsaw, I would really encourage people, if you have questions, please raise your hands. I think someone with a microphone would approach you to get your question. So Chris, on the network effect, to close out on this, we the people also, as you also mentioned in the book somewhere, that one blitzscaling idea kind of promotes many blitzscaling ideas, because any blitzscaling idea which succeeds helps all the citizens to adopt a solution at a very cheaper price for more value. Say, for example, a blitzscaler like Netflix offers all of us for $1 with equal or better quality what earlier broadcast and cable network used to offer for $10. So it means we end up saving $9. So what do you think, what additional things should happen in the society, according to you, in order for us to spend those $9 of savings on other blitzscaling ideas, so that many more ideas would end up blitzscaling in the society?
Absolutely. And I think that blitzscaling is going to be very essential for a lot of these things. I mean, one of the topics that people talk about a lot these days is climate change and the issues that we may be facing as a species when it comes to climate change. Well, if there's anything I know about climate change, they always show me these scary graphs. They talk about how much carbon has been poured into the atmosphere, and they talk about how difficult it is to make things change. And it is difficult to change things. But, what the most important thing is to be able to convince the millions and billions of people to make a change in their life, or to build breakthrough technologies that fundamentally transform how we deal with carbon in the atmosphere. I'm talking about things like direct capture, where you're able to just pull it out of the air, or maybe developing new kinds of uh, organisms that are going to consume it, fix it, convert it into something useful as opposed to as a pollutant. So I think that blitzscaling is going to be enormously valuable for that. And I think that part of it is the less money we have to spend just getting the world to run right now, the more money we can invest in the future. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And I'm hoping that a lot of that money is going to be invested in solving humanity's great problems. And some of it's already happening. Obviously, you take a look at the automotive industry, and it's converting over into electric. Right? If you went back in time 15 years and told people, hey, the industry is going to convert to electric, they'd say, you're crazy. And they would say Elon Musk is crazy. But look, he's managed to transform how the entire world thinks about automobiles. That's pretty amazing. He's in the process of transforming how the entire world thinks about space. That's amazing. And hopefully he will not be the exception, but the rule with many others joining him.
Awesome, Chris. I think it's not always enough time to speak with you on Blitzscaling. We can go on and on. So let's turn back to our first question. So now we open up for Q&A. I also have some questions. So yeah,
Uh,
back to Warsaw.
Thank you for telling the information which you provided right now. I was just curious, even about, for example, stopping war, and at least even that everyone will be paid for at least talking about stopping war and maybe even thinking about solution of stopping the war. So as you mentioned, if people will be provided free food, and of course there will be a proof that they were provided free food. So it could be that everyone will be recorded and that every unique face will be recorded that they have this free food, or could be even easier that some people will not pretend that they are helping, because when they are not helping, their society or people in Africa can solve everything, but they don't want to be manipulated. And as far as especially stopping war, in my opinion, the worst idea is to make some kind of constraints on Russia that to block them, because every nation is good. So we should help people to have the truth. It means could be unstoppable internet, could be free internet, could be, yeah, mostly free internet everywhere, and connect with free food. And as far as Ukraine, doing yourself anti-rocket system, and on DARPA, especially when you do, it's the uni which create the aeroplanes. There are DARPA, I forgot the name of it. The DARPA presents, DARPA presents, there are also some kind of judges. There are many teams, and they're creating many spaces in this case to go, for example, to the moon. But in this case, they could create the space for anti-rocket system, and could be anti-rocket system which may or may not be allowed to use for any other purpose than defense. It means it's like we could, for example, think about like a Spider-Man. The Spider-Man, this nets, it's not used to create any danger, and mostly it's like creating the coin, which is only for a good purpose. And maybe also other reason, it's like the proof of truth. It means when someone is recording this cell 24 hours, he cannot it's like I will be paying him the proof, or you are not a killer. The first of all, this coin won't have any value, but when people will understand that when you record your 24 hours, then it's the proof that you are a good person, because you are 24 hours every day. These were huge amount of questions. Yeah, there were.
Okay, so I think I can cover a lot of them along the way. So I think that there are a lot of fascinating things that you've brought up. So first of all, obviously, I think everyone is very saddened by the war that's happening right now, and it's been remarkable to see the degree to which technology has been used. Right, what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in how warfare is being conducted, with less traditional means like the man-launched anti-aircraft weapons, man-launched anti-tank weapons, suddenly being able to take out the extremely expensive military hardware that we thought was the dominant force on the battlefield. And that's a great example of disruption from below, right? Instead of defeating tanks with even bigger tanks and even more powerful tanks, you're defeating tanks with something that is too small for the tank to actually counteract. So that, I think, is a fascinating example of how the disruption is occurring in the battlefield. Now, part of what you described is, can we get to the point where we build a society where people do not feel like they're going to go to war. Where we have enough open information so that people everywhere can get whatever information they need to seek the truth as they see it. Whereas obviously we have a lot of regions of the world right now where where information flow is severely cut off, and people use things like VPNs to get through them. But even then, it's very difficult. So I do think that we are moving in that direction with technology. Obviously, we've seen Starlink deploy its internet access as a part of this conflict to help people stay in touch. And it may very well be that sometime in the future, we'll all be connected via satellite for free, and everyone in the world, whoever wants it, will be able to have the ability to access the internet. This will, of course, terrify many of the autocratic rulers that exist. They'll try to stop it. But if the technology becomes inexpensive enough and it becomes something that people can make on their own, then it probably will be unstoppable. Now, in terms of thinking about things like identity verification, I think a fascinating project is the WorldCoin project that Sam Altman launched. Sam Altman used to be the president of Y Combinator. A lot of people, including me, have made fun of the project because they're proposing to give crypto to everyone in the world, and they've created these orbs that scan people's retinas. And people say, well, that's creepy, and what are you going to do with it? And they haven't actually paid anyone. And so there's all these potential problems along the way. But I want you to consider what would happen if we actually had a database of the world based on retinal scans, such that, if we were to give out crypto to everyone in the world, maybe next time we're giving out food to everyone in the world, we're giving out some other resource to everyone. So it becomes a platform on top of which fascinating additional things can be made. Again, these are all interesting thoughts, and I think that it's going to take a while to get there, but you'd be surprised how quickly the future arrives.
So thanks, Chris, for that. I think maybe there's another question in the room. Would you mind people, telling your name, your affiliation, and then be a little bit more brief to the question? I appreciate it.
Hi, Chris. My name is David from MIT Enterprise Forum CE. And my question will be, as you were speaking, one term came into my mind, which is resilience. And how people adapt to new technologies and new stuff. And what would you be like, I don't know, top 3 advice or one advice of yours that is very important regarding resilience? Thanks.
That is such a fantastic point. And of course, as we all know, the ARPANET and the internet was originally designed as an instrument of resilience. Hopefully it will never be tested, but the idea was that it would be able to route around problems in the event of a nuclear war. So hopefully we never have to face that, but the resilience that the internet has created is a great metaphor for what we're looking for. So as an individual, I think the most important element of resilience is the ability to learn, to go out and bring in information. And for me, that means consuming information from a variety of different sources and being able to develop the critical thinking skills to decide, is information correct? Is it incorrect? What does it mean? I think over the course of the past 2+ years of this pandemic, we've seen that information can easily go awry and that people can sometimes reach conclusions that are not warranted by the evidence. Simply because of emotions or because of affiliations. So I think one of the most important elements of resilience is how to learn, how to process information, how to seek it out, how to find it, and how to decide for yourself what the truth is.
So here is a question from David Bloomstein from the UK. So he asks, what are the 3 most common attributes of CEOs who have successfully blitzscaled their startups?
Excellent. So the important things, I've already talked about some of them, but I'll mention them briefly in passing. The first is being able to learn. Because when you are blitzscaling, you are almost certainly blitzscaling in either a new market or a market that's been fundamentally transformed. And so the old playbooks, the old lessons may not necessarily apply. That's very uncomfortable. But if you're really good at learning and you're willing to admit when you don't know something, you're much more likely to succeed. The second thing is, just as we described, you need to develop your storytelling ability. By the way, this doesn't mean that you have to become, a stand-up comedian. Of course, it's better if you're funny, if you're entertaining, all those things. But there are people who are great communicators despite not having those skills. If you have a great story and you learn how to tell it and you learn how to compel your employees, your customers, your investors, and the general public to really buy into your vision, you're much more likely to succeed. The final thing is that just in general, these entrepreneurs need to have the ability to focus. It's so easy to become distracted. There's so many things going on. The great entrepreneurs, the great blitzscalers figure out what's really important and concentrate on that.
Before I jump into the next question in the room, here was a question from Mohammed Ashraf, a fellow founder from the Netherlands. He asks this, which is not actually very pleasant for all the founders out there. I know it's hard to take as a founder uh, when our idea that we are working on is realized not to blitz scale. My fellow founders, I know all of us want to build unicorns. We dream of making our early employees millionaires overnight, one fine night before we ring that bell on the NASDAQ. I get you, I'm with you, but I'm on the same boat. But let's face it, it's not that all ideas are meant to blitz scale. So he asks, when and how do founders get some hints that their business is not up for blitz scaling, even before the market gives the verdict?
So there's two main things that they need to look out for. The first is to look at the frequency and intensity of the product usage. So the thing is, in the long run, the feedback the market will give you is, they buy the product or they keep buying the product or the company itself is sold or IPOs, right? That's wonderful feedback. And when that happens, you clearly know you've made it, but you can't wait until that point in time to learn from what you're doing because it just takes too long. And so the earliest thing I can think you can concentrate on is the frequency and intensity of usage. Because when people use something frequently and intensively, and it's important to them, then it generally is valuable. And if they never use something, it's pretty rare that it's going to be valuable. So if you build a product and no one uses it, and even the few people who adopt it eventually fall off, that's a terrible sign. That's a problem you got to fix before you ever think about blitzscaling. The other element of it is, in addition to that frequency and intensity of usage, it's how difficult is it for me to acquire customers? Because blitzscaling is about scale. You have to be able to acquire those customers and users. And if you work really hard and you acquire customers and it still costs you 3 or 4 times as much as you need to get to, and just raising more money isn't going to fix the problem. You're going to get more people in, but each one of them is going to be a money loser. So you got to fix the customer acquisition as well. And if you can't fix customer acquisition, that's probably a sign that you should not scale.
Gotcha. So we take up the next question
another
from the room.
per minute, Balaji, excuse me, we have another question from the audience, and I think it will be the last one. So please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, everyone.
Last question.
My name is Asif. It's a bit related to a question that there was already, but you referred the example of Airbnb, for example, right? And from the Airbnb, we know that the founders went to the home of the first hosts and helped them take the pictures and prepare all that stuff. So for me, as a prospective founder, the question is about timing, right? Till when should you try this product market fit, then to start the blitzscale? Is there some metric that you should use to give up or to continue?
Certainly. So it really boils down to that frequency and usage. There are a couple of things that will generally show up. So for example, are you getting good retention? Like what is the level of retention over time? And usually going out 90 days is enough. I mean, going beyond that is great. You can just look at how the curve is going. But if you think about it, if you look at the people you bring in at this point in time, and then slowly some of them drop off, does it just drop off all the way down to zero? Or does it drop off and then eventually hit a level point? Because when you have that, that indicates that people have developed the habit of using your product. So look at that cohort analysis very carefully. One of the companies I just invested in, what they do is they do mobile ticketing last minute for events and performances, sporting events and concerts and things like that. And they do cohort analysis on the people that come in as customers. And they look at how much money the people spend in year 1, how much they spend in year 2, how much they spend in year 3, and so on and so forth. And the reason we got so excited about this company is while the amount that people would spend would decline, because you expect that people pass away, people move, people just stop using apps. That happens. But the level that they would level out at was they would still have 70% of the same amount of revenue in year 5 that they did in year 1. Well, that's incredible, right? That is a huge sign that, in fact, this is a sustainable business, that your customers stick with you over time, and that therefore you should be scaling and getting as many customers as possible.
So thank you, Chris. I really appreciate your time, and I hope before we speak next time, there would be many more Blitzscaling startups out there in the market, and looking forward. So it's back to you, Ivana.
Thank you very
Fantastic. Thank you,
much.
everyone, so much.
Thank you, Chris, Balaji, for this insightful discussion. I hope we all learned some secret sauce how to build mega companies from ground zero. We plan to continue this kind of chats in the future, so please follow us on LinkedIn to be informed about upcoming events. We are also hiring in Poland, so we are looking for smart developers who aspire to work for a Silicon Valley startup. So please follow us. Thank you very much for coming. Many thanks to Venture Cafe and Alpha Wolf Summit for co-organizing this event. Have a nice evening and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivona. Thank you, every single one of you who has been with us throughout all of that day. You may not know me. That is